Hi there, this is Ed McGuire, Insights Partner with Momenta Partners. Welcome to the Momenta Intelligent Edge podcast series, where we feature leading practitioners and thinkers across connected industry and the broader technology landscape. Welcome, everybody, to the Momenta Edge podcast. We're kicking off this episode with actually one of my favorite thinkers and writers, Tony Seba. This is Ed McGuire. I'm Insights Partner at Momenta. And Tony and I have known each other for a few years now. I first discovered his work when a friend of ours, mutual friend, had raved about his book, Clean Disruption of Energy and Transportation, which he published in 2014. And when I read it, I was so moved by the compelling argument that he made that was based in a lot of data and an enormous amount of background research that I reached out to Tony, and we ended up working together to help bring his message to a number of people in the investment community. And last year, Tony, who's the co-founder of RethinkX, published another piece out of the RethinkX think tank with his partner, James Arbib, all about the coming transportation disruption. So what we'll do in the podcast is to have Tony provide some background, some context around some of his work, and then we'll dive right into it. So Tony, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to second what you said, that you were truly one of the first really big influentials who discovered the clean disruption and really understood the disruptive power of energy and transportation and so on. So I thank you for that. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Terrific. Well, what I'd like to ask is I guess before we dive into the thesis around clean disruption, just to provide a bit of context of your background and how your experience had led you to focus on disruptive and exponential technologies.
Yeah, so I have an undergraduate degree in computer science from MIT. I did my MBA at Stanford, and while I was at Stanford, I started working for a then little company called Cisco Systems. So I was an early employee, and we were talking about essentially this internet thing being all over 1 billion hosts and so on, and folks did not understand how large that was going to be, but we did. And the reason we did was that the costs of the technology were coming down exponentially, and also the linked to that, the market was growing exponentially also. And if you and so we saw the power of the internet, and I made some predictions back then. This is in 1994 or so, that by 2010 there would be about 1 billion web hosts, internet hosts, and I was within a couple of years of that happening. Then I joined another startup company called RSA Data Security, which ended up putting the encryption in essentially all servers and browsers and all internet-connected devices at the time. And so I've been in many disruptive companies. I started my own couple of companies and so on. After that, I actually decided to take a couple of years off and go and teach, essentially do one of the things that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And I thought I would take 2 years off and teach and write a book. And 12 years later, I had written 3 books, and I was still teaching. And so I found that that side of the equation, the thinking part, was something that I enjoyed. the synthesizing the world was something that I enjoyed very much. And I made my work disruption. So essentially coming from technology and coming from the business angle, I started thinking about disruption very early. And I discovered that the disruption concepts at the time did not really explain everything. They did not explain the smartphone disruption, for instance. They did not explain Uber, ride-hailing, for instance, and so on. So essentially, I discovered that it was incomplete, and I set out to build a new framework for disruption that incorporated all the elements that I had learned about throughout my career. And so what I came up with was something that I call the Seba Technology Disruption Framework, which essentially says that technology disruptions happen because of a combination, so a convergence of technology cost curves, of business model innovation and product innovation, all of which are enabled by this convergence of technologies. And there are several ways to disrupt. Traditionally, we thought of it as disruption from below, but I also discovered that there was a disruption from above, and some other folks discovered Big Bang disruption and disruption from the edge and so on. And I put this together. And then I wrote Clean Disruption. And Clean Disruption was a way for me to prove or disprove that this framework worked. And essentially what I forecast, as you know, in Clean Disruption, was that there were 4 technologies in one business model. So solar, batteries, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and ride-hailing, that were disruptive in their own way, but combined would disrupt all of energy and transportation, that the disruption would be over by about 2030. Essentially, by 2030, it would be all batteries, all solar, all electric vehicles, and self-driving and car sharing and so on. And this is 4 years ago. At the time, it was pretty radical, if you will. But what it did was reframe the energy and transportation industries and reframe the whole narrative that making this transition to clean energy and transportation was going to be multi-decades and expensive and so on, and turn it into, well, actually, this is going to happen. This is going to happen pretty quickly. This is going to happen for purely economic reasons. And it's going to happen, and we're on the cusp of these disruptions. Mm-hmm. And so that's, of course, how you and I met 4 years ago. And the predictions that I made at the time, which some thought were pretty insane, are essentially on the money, and some of them actually are a little conservative with what's going on today. So after that, I decided to start a think tank called RethinkX because it turns out that my disruption framework does work, and it does work not just for energy and transportation, but also across the board. One of my hypotheses was that every single industry, bar none, every single industry is going to be disrupted by this combination of technologies and business model innovation and product innovation. And the decade of the 2020s is going to be the most disruptive decade in history, because everything will be disrupted and it's all going to happen at the same time. And what I found through Clean Disruption was that a lot of our leaders, whether it's business leaders or investors or policymakers, were not ready. We're not thinking in this way. So that's why I started RethinkX, which essentially it's an independent think tank that analyzes and forecasts the speed and scale of all disruptions. And our first report was called Rethinking Transportation, which came out last May, which was in a way Clean Disruption 2.0 for transportation. And we made the prediction that it was the convergence of autonomous, electric, and on-demand transportation that would disrupt all of transportation. And the tipping point was going to be 2021. Essentially, on the day that autonomous vehicles, level 4 autonomous vehicles were approved and ready, which we assume will be 2021, the cost per mile of transportation will be 1/10, 10x cheaper than the cost of owning a car. So essentially, this is going to disrupt two things. The concept of individual car ownership is going to go away because 10x has always enabled a disruption, meaning a 10x difference in cost for a similar product or service has always, every single time in history, caused a disruption. And also, this is going to cause the disruption of the internal combustion engine industry. So people are going to stop buying cars altogether, and they're going to stop, and anybody's going to stop buying gasoline and diesel cars and trucks and so on and so forth. And of course, this has implications throughout the value chain for the oil industry, and that is going to happen even more quickly. And because, as you know, in the oil industry, so we forecast that the demand for oil is going to peak around 2020 at about 100 million barrels per day. And it's going to go down to about 70 million in 2030, based purely on the car market. I mean, this doesn't include all forms of transportation. But the price is going to collapse immediately. And that's because in oil markets, all you need is a 2 or 3 million barrel oversupply for prices to collapse. And we learned that in 2014, 2015, when oil came down from 111 to 29. And we see that there is going to be that 2-3 million barrel oversupply by about 2021, maybe 2022. So prices are going to collapse to the equilibrium. Is going to be as soon as 2021 or two. But there will be this equilibrium. So who knows what the bottom is going to be. But if you assume that it's going to go to equilibrium, which is $25 a barrel, that essentially means for investors out there and so on that any oil that cannot compete at 25 will be stranded. So what that means is that deep water oil will be stranded right away and forever. Shale oil is going to be stranded. Anything that can compete at 25. And sands, of course, is going to be stranded because it can't compete at 25. So, and that's going to happen in the early 2020s, 2021, 2022. So there's going to be trillions of dollars of assets that, may be stranded quickly. I mean, we're talking about 3-4 years from now. Mm-hmm. And this has implications along the value chain, of course. Right. If because it's not just that oil, but it's also all the assets associated with it. It's the pipelines, it's the refineries, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be a pretty massive disruption of the oil industry that's going to be caused by the disruption of transportation.
So Tony, I want to back up a little bit, and I do want to return to the specific work and the forecasts you've made. But historically, the ability to forecast disruption or anticipate disruption has eluded experts. And I think you've done quite a bit of work where you have highlighted in the past how disruption can come really quickly. Why is it that experts or forecasters in different industries, and we can pull a couple of examples from history pretty easily around photography and automobiles of the past, why is it that people have had such a difficult time, not so much anticipating that disruption will come, but anticipating the speed and magnitude of disruption?
Yeah, so from a corporate perspective, even when you anticipate that it's coming, so, the classic example of Kodak, Kodak invented digital imaging. They knew that it was coming. They knew how quickly it was coming. They had invested billions of dollars into developing digital camera systems and so on. And yet they were disrupted by their own invention, not because they didn't know it was coming, not because they didn't know how quickly it was coming, but because culturally they were not able to pivot to a new business model, because disruptions bring, in many cases, new metrics, new business models, and it's hard for these corporations to pivot into the new culture and business models and metrics that come with the disruption. From the experts and analysts' perspective, it's usually that they make linear predictions. Everything is linear. I mean, even now that we know a lot more about disruption, you see a lot of these predictions, say from the Energy Information Agency, from the International Energy Agency, from Wall Street mainstream analysts, and they're usually linear. And they say, last year there were 500,000 electric vehicles sold. If you grow that by, pull a number out of a hat, 35% per year, then you're going to get whatever, 35% penetration by 2040. And in reality, disruptions and technology adoption itself never is a linear progression ever. I mean, technology adoption happens in S-curves. Once you hit the tipping point, it accelerates. It accelerates and it basically wipes out the market in months or in a few years. And so experts and mainstream analysts fail to see the S-curve, that it's going to accelerate and wipe out the existing industry. And a lot of that is that they work with Excel spreadsheets that only do, these lines, right? And they don't do the system dynamics. I mean, technology adoption has feedback loops, positive and negatives. They have network effects. Once your neighbor adopts something, then you adopt it, and then that feeds on itself, and so on. Once platforms, for instance, operating systems, the more users you have, the more developers you get, and so it feeds. That's a positive feedback loop, and of course, the incumbents get into a negative feedback loop, and that happens exponentially. So mainstream analysts and experts fail to see that, to put that into their models, and failing to look at the S-curves essentially is a failure to anticipate disruptions.
Right. So in 2014, when you released Clean Disruption of Energy and Transportation, it was a really interesting time for you to be making those predictions, because you had based your work on the analysis of cost curves around solar, batteries, electric vehicles. Tesla was really just starting to hit its stride, and as you're making your predictions, I think you got some pushback from people who were skeptical of your forecasts. But in the intervening years, I think what's happened is that your framework has been very much validated. Could you provide a bit of color, at least, on how you had initially envisioned this combinatorial evolution, or this combinatorial disruption, and particularly addressing on the energy side, and at Momenta, we hold energy. It's very close to our hearts as well, and understanding that the changes. How has the industry evolved when you look back at your original predictions, and when you see some of the original pushback, or the original, objections to your predictions? How has that played out in the interim?
Beautifully. What I did was both create a new framework, and when I made the predictions, I also provided the formula, so that I, told my audiences and told the world, look, this is how I'm doing the forecast. These are the cost curves. So at the time, I said the cost of lithium-ion batteries is going down by about 16% per year. And so if you take that over the next 3, 5, 7, 15 years, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get $100 per kilowatt hour by such a year, and $80 by such a year. Now, if you don't believe it's going to be 16%, if you believe it's going to be 10%, then you can bake that into your own model. So I provided not just the forecast, but the framework that people could put into their own models to test it, to test whether, I was going to be right or not right. And it turned out that I have been right. And in fact, it has turned out that, for instance, for lithium-ion batteries, it has accelerated. I mean, a lot of pushback at the time, 4 years ago, was that 16% improvement in the cost of lithium-ion batteries, that's insane. That's not going to happen. And, they were right. It's been 20%. And so even faster than I had said at the time. And that's not surprising for me, but essentially, so I provided both the forecast and the framework so that folks could put in their own numbers and test it, and many of my presentations saying what you should do is come back, is have some group to test it. I mean, come back in 6 months and see how my forecasts are doing, and come back in 9 months and in 12 months and see how I'm doing. And if I'm on the money, then there is something there, right? And it turns out that I have been right on the money. I mean, I predicted 4 years ago that by this time, February of 2018, that the market would offer unsubsidized electric vehicles with 200-mile plus range in the $35,000 to $40,000 range. And of course, a lot of folks thought I was insane. And guess what? We have 2 already, with many more announced for the rest of this year. So, again, part of what I did is provide both the framework in a way that folks could test it, in a scientific way. I seldom said, trust me. In fact, I don't say that. But I provided a way that people, scientific method in which they could test the hypothesis. And maybe if they thought that, or they had better information and they thought that it would accelerate, then they could bake that into their own models. And so that made a big difference. And as the years went by, and my numbers for solar and for batteries and for EVs and so on have proven to be right, then they're paying more attention. Essentially, that has changed the whole narrative about how quickly this disruption is going to happen, that this is not an energy transition, that this is a disruption, both energy and transportation. And that's because I was totally open in terms of how I was coming up with these models.
Yeah, I thought that was you were always very open about any questioning of your assumptions. You had built a very transparent framework, and I thought that was what made the message really compelling. Was that you certainly didn't have to take it or leave it. People could test it on their own, and it has been pretty remarkable how a lot of these predictions have unfolded. Now, I want to move a bit forward to the work that you've been doing around Rethink X, because you took the disruption thesis, and then you took it another stage deeper by looking at autonomy and this whole concept of transportation as a service. And you and James were very, very kind to let me take a look at your underlying assumptions and the and really the math behind your calculations. And I have to say, it was very hard. I mean, I really tried to poke holes in it, and you all had really thought up through a lot of these implications. So could you talk a bit about where that work has led you in terms of your conclusions and the predictions? But also, I'm gonna, I'd like to go a little bit downstream, because you thought about the implications for not just business and government, but also society going forward. And this, I think, is what's really the most interesting part and the most interesting aspect of the work.
Yeah, thank you. So and thanks for the feedback, participating in that work. So we took the disruption of transportation that I had been working on, and we took it a step further, actually deeper and broader. And what we said was, okay, so it's been 3 years, and so we have new numbers and new discoveries and new things have been happening and accelerating. So let's do a deeper dive into how this disruption of transportation is going to happen. And essentially what we discovered in that process was that the convergence. So, a lot of companies had invested in autonomous technology. We had 40 plus companies, and, Google and Tesla and any number of companies were way down the road in no pun intended, in autonomous technology. And so we made the assumption that the moment that that autonomous technology was going to happen was 2021. And that's because, again, of many of the cost curves for LiDAR, for supercomputing power, for GPUs, we knew that a lot better last year than I know it 4 or 5 years ago. And so we made, when we did the convergence of autonomous ride hailing, so Uber and Lyft and Didi and so on had gained huge market share by that time. I mean, 20% of all the vehicle miles traveled in San Francisco are Uber and Lyft. And these are companies that did not exist 10 years ago. And that's at today's prices. And so when we did the numbers on the convergence of these three things, essentially that's how we came up with the number, the idea that by 2021, transportation as a service, which essentially means on demand, autonomous and electric, was going to be 1/10 of the cost of transportation, of owning your car. And 2021, I mean, that's around the corner. That was not something that I hadn't put that number in clean disruption, but we had a lot more data to put that together. And we discovered a lot more things about EVs themselves. I mean, EVs last 500,000 miles against 140,000 miles or 200 for internal combustion engine vehicles. And so when you bake those numbers into our models, essentially what we came up with this deeper, faster, or actually the computer models came up with this deeper, faster disruption that would start 2021. Essentially, it would tip 2021. It has already started. And essentially by 2030, 95% of all miles will be autonomous, electric, and on demand. And it validated many of the things that I had previously said in clean disruption. And what we added, as you mentioned, which is the reason that I started RethinkX, is not just to forecast disruption. I had proved that I can do that fairly accurately. It was what are the implications for the whole supply chain, and of course for society, and what are the choices that society will need to make to take advantage of the upside while also mitigating the downside. So when the concept of individual ownership of cars goes away, which essentially our model says it's going to go away because of purely economic reasons. Essentially, that means that dealerships are going to go away. Mechanics are going to go away. Also because electric vehicles only have 20 moving parts, as opposed to gasoline vehicles, which have 2,000 plus moving parts. So electric vehicles don't need the kind of maintenance that internal combustion engine vehicles need, and so on, right? So we did the analysis down the value chain, and we forecast that, for instance, by 2025, dealerships are going to disappear. Mechanics are going to disappear by and large. Gas stations are going to disappear. And that's because of the disruption. So we went very much deeper, and we went back the value chain. And what does this mean for society? What this means is that we're going to have, drivers, of course, driver jobs, because it's all going to be autonomous, are going to go away. Not all at once, but it's going to happen very quickly. So we're going to have, 7-8 million folks who are going to be out of work in the United States within a fairly short number of years. So we need to mitigate that downside of the disruption. The upside is huge. It's that, every American family is going to save about $6,000 a year by using transport as a service, as opposed to by owning a car. $6,000 a year is huge. I mean, half of American families have less than $1,000 in savings. Half of American families are a month away from, homelessness, if you will. So, $6,000 a year forever, pretty much, savings is a huge boost to consumer spending, $1 trillion boost at the macroeconomic level for the GDP in America. And that goes to our pockets. I mean, that's not something that goes to Google or whoever is going to win, whoever corporate is going to win. That goes down to, the American family's pocket. Of course, there's another $1 trillion in addition, by we not driving, and by we, nurses can nurse, and doctors can doctor, and consultants can consult, and so on, while we not drive. That's an additional $1 trillion in GDP gains. So, there are $2 trillion at least in GDP gain for the United States, which is huge. But of course, there's a downside. And so the choices that as a society we need to make are pretty clear. We need to enable this disruption because it's going to be a huge boost to American families. But we also need to mitigate the downside for the millions who are going to be jobless, because every disruption leaves folks without a job. And we need to provide education and financial support and healthcare support and so on, while they make a transition to new jobs and new industries. So we were looking down the value chain to what the implications for society would be. Cities are going to be massively transformed. I mean, when we have now, with the individual ownership model of transportation, we use cars 4% of the time. When you have, imagine Uber, electric, and autonomous, and they use them 40% of the time. That means that about 80 or 90% of parking spaces are going to be unused. They're going to be obsolete. So that in many cities is about a third of the land mass of many American cities. I mean, Fort Worth is 40% parking. 80% of that, you get that a third of Fort Worth is going to be empty. Los Angeles is 2/3 parking and roads. So, they're going to have a massive desert not in the middle, but a lot of land available. And so from a social perspective, we have a choice to make. What are we going to do with that third of the city that's going to be empty? Are we going to have green parks? Are we going to have businesses? Are we going to have affordable housing? And those are the types of choices that we need to make. And that's what Rethink X is all about. It's analyze the disruption, what the implications are down the value chain, and also what the choices that we need to make as a society to essentially take advantage of the upside and mitigate the downside. And we're doing this across the industries, by the way. Transportation was just the first one. We're currently doing energy, and that's essentially, clean disruption 2.0. And we're doing agriculture. So food is going to be massively disrupted. And this is not something that is in the public conversation. Food is going to be massively disrupted. Healthcare is going to be disrupted, and so on. So, and this is going to be a set of disruptions that are going to go on in parallel, and they're going to be huge, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Energy is going to be 10 times cheaper. Transportation is going to be 10 times cheaper. So that's quantitatively. Qualitatively, in the sense that most energy is going to be generated locally with solar and batteries and so on, and wind. It's not going to be generated out there somewhere by central generating stations. So essentially, this is, if you will, a disruption from the edge. Communities are going to be more resilient because they're going to be able to generate their own energy. They're going to be able to store it, and they're going to be able to use it in electric vehicles and so on. So that's the qualitative part. And the same thing is going to happen with food, where essentially many of the disruptions that are coming into food, the disruption of the cow, the disruption of agriculture itself, and so on. What that means is that production, generation of a lot of the products and services that are generated out there somewhere now are going to be locally generated. So that's the qualitative part. So things are going to be massively cheaper, and also they're going to be by and large generated locally. And that essentially means that the institutions that we have now, and the governance systems that we have now, and even the investment theses that we have now are going to change dramatically. We're going to need new forms of what I call a new operating system for humanity, because many of the metrics and the organizations and the institutions that we have now are not built for this new world that we're going to have. And this new world is happening now. I mean, basically, we're talking 2030. We're not talking 2100. We're talking 2030.
Right.
And yeah, so that's what we're doing at RethinkX. We're going to put out reports and papers over the following year in all of these industries that I mentioned.
So it really is just this comprehensive refactoring and reimagination of the future it is pretty profound. And I would agree with you that we haven't ever seen this confluence of powerful transformative technologies that are hitting exponential impact at the same time. And you combine energy and transportation and robotics and AI and medicine and even innovations like blockchain and decentralized organizations. It is pretty amazing. So what you've talked about really cuts to a lot of the work that we're doing at Momenta, which is helping really trying to envision a connected future. This the concept of transportation as a service and the way cities are going to be rethinking their public spaces and how we create these systems that are connected in the future. It's going to transform as well the existing businesses, and in a sense it's that shift from product to service, and it's a business model shift. It's also a mindset shift. As you look forward, I mean, what advice do you give to businesses and manufacturers that are particularly auto manufacturers, but also the energy companies that you're talking to? I just want to choose those two because I know we could dive into this for weeks. But when you look at those two, what advice do you give them when they are looking at the disruption ahead of them and how they can apply the technologies most beneficially to really navigate and affect a win-win transition to the extent that that's possible?
Yeah, what I tell them is interestingly, I tell them, look, you have the advantage. I mean, you have the power, no pun intended. Utilities now have a relationship with millions of customers, and when you look at the highest cost in installed solar, for instance, the highest costs are not photovoltaics. Photovoltaics is so cheap. I mean, it's nearly free. I mean, compared to the cost of customer acquisition and compared to the cost of capital, for instance. And utilities now have the relationship with the customer, so they can take advantage of that to build the solar infrastructure. And they also have today they have a low cost of capital. That's not going to last 2-3 years. In 3 years, the world will be massively different. I mean, the tipping point for these disruption, both energy and transport, is going to be 2020, 2021. So we're not that far away. So they have the advantage right now. Auto companies know manufacturing very well. A lot of the disruptors, have never built a factory before and manufactured hardware before. And so, the incumbents have advantages in terms of brand, in terms of access to capital, in terms of the ability to manufacture and so on. So they can take advantage of that and be the disruptor rather than be disrupted. And so that's what I tell them. You right now, at this point in time, you have the advantage, but you're in an existential crisis also, meaning that this is not going to this advantage is not going to last forever. It's only going to last a year or two. And if you don't take advantage and become the disruptor, essentially you're out of business. the whole business model you're in is going to go away, and it's going to happen very quickly. And so, I give them the good news and the bad news, right? And if you're willing to disrupt your business model and the way that you've done business for 100 years, instead of resisting, which a lot of utilities and car companies and so on are resisting, then you can be one of the winners. And it's going to be a new business model, and it's going to be a new set of metrics and so on. But you can take advantage, because now you can anticipate the disruption. And so that's the advice that I give them.
Well, and I think that's advice really that's operative for people in almost any industry. So, in particular, and that idea of innovation from the edge is certainly close to my heart, and the empowerment of production and value creation, really from the source, and the ability to rethink industries it really is an amazing time to be around, and we all have an opportunity to shape all of this.
We do. It's a great, yes, we all do. And one thing that I tell the utilities, for instance, to challenge their thinking a little bit is, imagine that kilowatt hours are free. The cost of energy is free. How would you make money if kilowatt hours were free? So essentially, that's your challenge. You need to think about new business models, because in the future, energy is going down in cost so dramatically. You're not going to be able to build huge businesses with just kilowatt hours. And so, if they can get over the idea that kilowatt hours are going to be free, or close to free, then they're in a good position to be, survivors and disruptors.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, listen, I always like to wrap up my conversations with people, and as usual, Tony, your insights are provocative and thoughtful, and really invigorating too, because I think you leave people with a sense of optimism, but also a sense of realism as well, that the change is not going to be without some bumps along the road, and it can be quite messy, but looking to the other side, I think there are some just amazing benefits that that'll accrue to all of us. And I was just wondering, just to I like to ask people for recommendations of a resource or a recommendation that you could provide for our listeners that you like to share with people.
Yeah. So first, my pitch. Go to rethinkx.com, and there's a number, and all the stuff that we produce is free. You can download our Rethinking Transportation report. You can download everything for free. It's even in Chinese now. Now, having said that, I want to recommend a book that is far from energy and transportation, but not from disruption. I'm reading a book called Paper by Mark Kurlansky. And Kurlansky is a great writer and a great storyteller, but he tells the history of paper in a beautiful way. And of course, I'm an author and I'm interested and so on. But also, one of the interesting things that I find is the printing press, the connection between the invention of paper itself and the printing press disruption in Europe, the Gutenberg disruption and so on, comes alive pretty well in this book, even though I don't think it was his intent. It's a great book no matter what. But paper is something that we see every day, we touch every day, but we don't think about very much. And it comes alive in this book. So Paper by Mark Kurlansky.
That's a terrific recommendation. So, listen, it's been great to have you on this podcast. And I know that for all the people that have tuned in and listened here to the end, I was going to give a plug for your report, and you did that. But I would also recommend going back and picking up Tony's original book on clean disruption, which is available. We'll post a link to it in the show notes, but. Tony, it's as always. I think it's amazing to be able to see these predictions and these theses play out. And I know that you stick your neck out there and you put dates and real numbers behind your prediction, and that takes a lot of guts, but it's also backed up with a lot of work there. And I think we're. At least for the last couple of years, we've been kind of laughing, and it's really gratifying to see all of this play out. So, if all of what you had talked about, or even a fraction of it, plays out over the next few years, I think we've got some amazing times ahead.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, it has been gratifying. Thank you, and thanks for your kind words. And always happy to be on your show. Thank you for what you do.
All right, terrific, and thanks everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you for listening to the Momenta Intelligent Edge podcast. We rely on feedback, comments, and input from our listeners, so please interact with us by going to our LinkedIn page, our Twitter accounts, or email us at edge@momenta.partners with any suggestions, guest ideas, or commentary. We really value your input and appreciate your listening. Thanks a lot. This is Ed McGuire, Insights Partner with Momenta Partners.